Have you ever looked in the mirror and wondered who's staring back? That's how my day started. I'm Rachel Harper, 37 years old, married to Michael for over a decade. On paper, I've got it all. A cozy suburban home outside Austin, Texas, 2 healthy kids, and a husband with a steady job. But inside, there's nothing but emptiness. Michael works for a big tech company, drowning in meetings, reports, and late-night emails. His favorite room in the house is his office, and if he's not there, he's glued to the TV, scrolling on his phone during commercial breaks. When he speaks, it's functional, reminders about the kids' schedules or a question about the power bill. Sometimes I wonder if I could vanish, and he'd even notice. The days blur together. Laundry, groceries, soccer practice, dinner. Michael and I sleep in the same bed, but feel miles apart. I'm a ghost in my own life, drifting through routines with no one really seeing me. And then Jason knocked on our door. It was late afternoon. I'd been folding laundry in the living room, the smell of fabric softener still clinging to my hands. When I heard the knock, I glanced out the window and saw him standing there. Jason Miller, our neighbor's 25-year-old son, back from college for the summer. Tall, confident, with a disarming smile that could charm just about anyone. I opened the door, expecting some quick question about mail or lawn care. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice warm and easy. "I'm helping my dad with some projects and saw the tree in your backyard. It looks like a branch might have broken during the storm. Want me to take a look?" It wasn't unusual for Jason to be helpful. He'd done odd jobs around the neighborhood since he was a teenager. But something about the way he looked at me felt different, like he wasn't just talking about the tree. "Oh," I stammered, caught off guard. "That's kind of you." "Sure, if you don't mind." Before I could say more, he smiled, a confident, boyish grin, and stepped into the backyard. I followed, trying not to overthink the way my pulse quickened. He wasn't doing anything inappropriate, just being polite, but when was the last time anyone had offered to help me like that?
Michael used to.
Now, he barely notices when the trash needs to be taken out. Jason inspected the tree, pointing out where the branch had snapped clean off. As he talked, I realized how long it had been since I'd had a casual conversation that wasn't about logistics or responsibilities. "This shouldn't take long," Jason said, grabbing a pair of gloves from his tool belt. "If you've got a saw, I can trim this for you now." "Actually, I think Michael has one in the garage," I replied, leading him to the side door. I pushed it open, revealing the chaos inside. Boxes stacked haphazardly, old tools gathering dust, and a bike the kids hadn't ridden in years. "Wow," Jason said, chuckling. "Looks like your garage is as organized as ours." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that I hadn't heard from myself in months. "Yeah, we've been meaning to clean it out. It just keeps getting pushed to the bottom of the list." We found the saw, and Jason got to work. I watched him from the patio, pretending to scroll through my phone, but really, I was mesmerized by his focus. He moved with an easy confidence, like someone who knew exactly who they were and what they wanted. When he finished, he walked back to me, wiping his hands on a rag. "All set," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "Should hold up fine for now, but let me know if you need help with anything else." "Thank you, Jason," I said, meaning it more than I should have. "I really appreciate it." He nodded, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "Anytime," he said, before turning and walking back to his house. That night, as I sat on the couch next to Michael, him scrolling through his phone, me pretending to watch a show, I couldn't stop thinking about Jason. It wasn't just the way he looked or the sound of his voice. It was the way he made me feel seen, like I wasn't just a shadow in the background of someone else's life. For the first time in years, I felt alive. And that scared me more than anything. That evening, I found myself in the backyard, pulling weeds from the garden beds. It was one of those quiet suburban nights, the kind where the sound of cicadas fills the air and the sky glows faintly with the last light of day. I'd lost track of time, absorbed in the rhythm of my work, when I heard a familiar voice. "Hard at work, Mrs. Harper?" I looked up to see Jason leaning over the fence, his easy grin softening the sharpness of his jawline. There was something so casual about the way he stood, one arm resting on the top of the fence, the other tucked into the pocket of his jeans. "I guess someone has to keep this yard from turning into a jungle," I replied, brushing dirt from my hands. He laughed, a warm sound that felt oddly comforting. "Mind if I join you? I'm good at taking orders." Before I could say no, or yes, he vaulted over the fence and landed lightly on the grass. "You really don't have to, Jason," I said, though I didn't mean it. "I know," he said, already reaching for the weeds. "But I like being useful." We worked side by side, chatting about everything and nothing. He told me about his time in college, his plans to go into environmental science, and how he missed the open skies of Texas when he was in the city. I shared stories about the kids, how my daughter loved soccer, and my son couldn't get enough of space documentaries. And then, somehow, we were talking about me. "You know," Jason said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, "I don't think I've ever seen you take a break. You're always doing something for someone else." I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. "It's just how things are. There's always something to do." "Yeah, but what about you?" he asked, his voice softer now. "What do you do for yourself?" The question caught me off guard. I blinked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. What did I do for myself? When was the last time I'd done anything that wasn't for the kids, or Michael, or the house? "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with an expression that was equal parts understanding and something else, something I couldn't quite name. The air between us shifted, heavy with unspoken tension. I became acutely aware of how close we were, his shoulder brushing mine as we knelt in the dirt. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. "You deserve to, you know," he said, his voice low but firm. "Take care of yourself, I mean." I opened my mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, seen, valued, alive. Jason cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Anyway, I think we've got most of the weeds." He stood, brushing dirt from his jeans, and extended a hand to help me up. "Thanks," I said, my voice unsteady as I took his hand. His grip was strong but gentle, lingering just a second too long. As he walked back toward the fence, he turned and flashed that grin again. "Let me know if you need more help, Mrs. Harper. I'm just next door." I watched him go, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain or didn't want to. That night, as I lay in bed next to Michael, the silence between us felt louder than ever. I turned onto my side, staring at the wall, and tried to shake the image of Jason's eyes, his voice, the way he made me feel. But it was no use. For the first time in years, something had shifted inside me, and I didn't know what to do about it. The idea of meeting Jason for coffee came from nowhere, or at least that's what I told myself. Maybe it was a need for fresh air, a break from the monotony, or a chance to reclaim a part of myself that had been buried under years of responsibilities. I couldn't admit that I wanted to see him, not even to myself. The cafe was tucked away downtown, a cozy place I hadn't visited in years. As I stepped inside, the smell of roasted beans and freshly baked pastries greeted me. Jason was already there, seated at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood as I approached, his smile warm, disarming. "Rachel," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "Hi, Jason," I replied, feeling unsteady on my feet. We started with small talk, books, his plans after college, the weather. But it wasn't long before the conversation turned more personal, more real. "I don't know how you do it," Jason said, leaning forward slightly. His voice was soft but carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "Balancing everything. The kids, the house, your husband. You're like the glue holding it all together." His words hit deeper than I wanted to admit. I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. It's just part of life. You do what you have to do. But what about you? He pressed, his eyes searching mine. Who's looking out for you, Rachel? The question made my throat tighten. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell him he didn't understand. But he wasn't wrong. When was the last time anyone asked me what I needed? I don't know, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded, his gaze steady, unwavering. You deserve more, he said. To feel alive, to be happy. I wanted to push back, to tell him I was happy. I had a house, a family, a life that looked perfect from the outside. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't feel alive. I didn't feel anything. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging between us. I stared down at my coffee, the steam curling upward in lazy spirals. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the cup, taking a sip to steady myself. You're kind, Jason, I said, forcing a smile. But it's not that simple. Maybe it is, he replied, his voice soft but sure. You just have to believe it. The intensity of his gaze made it impossible to look away. It wasn't flirtation, it was something deeper, something that felt like he saw me in a way no one else had in years. I left the cafe feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. As I walked to my car, the cool evening air did little to calm the heat rising in my chest. My thoughts raced, jumbled and chaotic. Jason's words echoed in my mind. You deserve to feel alive. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. When I got home, Michael was on the couch, scrolling through his phone, oblivious as always. I sat beside him, the gap between us feeling more like a chasm. And for the first time, I realized how wide it had grown. The first time we met outside the neighborhood, I told myself it was harmless. Just coffee, just conversation. Jason had suggested it casually, like it was no big deal. But when I parked my car at a little diner on the outskirts of town, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Jason was waiting for me inside, seated in a booth near the back. He smiled when he saw me, that warm, effortless grin that always seemed to put me at ease and unravel me at the same time. You made it, he said as I slid into the seat across from him. Barely, I replied, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed the storm inside me. We talked for hours that day, about his future, my past, the pieces of life we never showed anyone else. He asked questions that no one had asked me in years, and I answered them without thinking, without fear. It felt so easy, so natural, to open up to him. It didn't stop at coffee. Our meetings became more frequent. Sometimes it was at the diner, other times in parks or quiet corners of the city where we could sit without being seen. Each time, the conversations grew deeper, the connection between us more undeniable. But the night everything changed wasn't planned. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where the clouds hung low and the streets glistened with puddles. Jason had texted earlier, asking if I was free. I told him I couldn't, too much to do, too risky. But as the day went on, the pull became too strong to resist. I found myself driving down a winding road just outside the city, the address he'd sent me glowing on my GPS. When I pulled into the gravel lot of a small, nondescript motel, I nearly turned around. But then I saw him, standing under the awning, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his hair damp from the rain. He walked to my car as I rolled down the window. You didn't have to come, he said, though the relief on his face told me otherwise. I know, I replied, my voice shaking. But I'm here. Jason hesitated for a moment, as if giving me one last chance to change my mind. Then he opened the door and gestured toward the motel. We can just talk, he said. Nothing more. I promise. But deep down, I think we both knew that wasn't true. The room was small and unremarkable, just a bed, a dresser, and a television mounted on the wall. The rain pattered softly against the window as I stood awkwardly near the door, unsure of what to do next. Jason leaned against the edge of the dresser, watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You're nervous," he said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. "We don't have to do this," he continued, his voice gentle. "If you want to leave, just say the word." I should have said it. I should have walked out the door and gone home to the life I'd built, the life I was about to destroy. But instead, I looked at him, and the weight of everything I'd been holding in, the loneliness, the longing, the aching need to feel alive, came crashing down. I stepped closer. Jason didn't move at first, as if waiting for me to make the choice. When I reached for him, his hand met mine, warm and steady, pulling me into an embrace that felt like both a relief and a betrayal. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're living," he said simply, his breath warm against my ear. The world outside faded away as we crossed the line I'd sworn I never would. His touch was electric, igniting parts of me I'd forgotten existed. It wasn't just physical. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. When it was over, the silence in the room was deafening. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, the weight of what we'd done settling heavily on my chest. "I should go," I said, though my legs felt too weak to move. Jason sat beside me, his hand brushing against mine. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice filled with something I couldn't name, concern, guilt, or maybe hope. "It's okay. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." But as I drove home through the rain, my mind raced with everything that wasn't okay. The vows I'd broken, the lies I'd have to tell, the undeniable truth that, for the first time in years, I felt alive, and the terrifying knowledge that I couldn't stop now. The guilt was unbearable. Every time I looked at Michael, I felt like he could see right through me. The way his eyes lingered on me when he came home from work, the slight furrow of his brow when I'd forget simple things like picking up milk or paying the water bill, each glance felt like an accusation, a reminder of the betrayal I was hiding. At first, I told myself it was all in my head, but then his questions started. "You've been different lately," Michael said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. The kids were upstairs, the clinking of their forks and plates replaced by an uncomfortable silence between us. "Different?" I asked, forcing a laugh. "I don't know what you mean." He set his fork down, his gaze steady. "I don't know. You've been distracted. Quiet. Is everything okay?" I smiled, but it felt like a mask. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." Michael didn't press further, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. And why would he be? I barely recognized myself anymore. I'd grown used to deleting messages from Jason before Michael could see them. Each meeting was planned carefully, every alibi rehearsed in my mind until it felt seamless. But I couldn't hide the changes in me. My hands trembled more often than not. I found myself avoiding eye contact, retreating to the bathroom or the backyard just to get a moment to breathe. The worst part wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the war inside me. Part of me wanted to confess, to lay it all out and beg for forgiveness. But another part, the part that came alive when Jason so much as looked at me, didn't want to stop. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt Michael shift beside me. "You're not sleeping again," he said, his voice cutting through the dark. "I'm fine," I replied automatically, though my chest felt like it was caving in. He didn't say anything else, but I could feel his frustration in the way he turned away from me, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. That weekend, things came to a head. Michael decided to take the kids out for the afternoon, some surprise trip to the arcade, and offered to let me stay home and relax. The offer sounded kind, even thoughtful, but I could feel the underlying tension in his words. "You should take a break," he said, his tone flat. "Maybe catch up on some of that sleep you've been missing." I forced a smile, nodding as I kissed the kids goodbye and watched them pile into the car. As soon as they pulled out of the driveway, my phone buzzed. It was Jason. Are you free? I hesitated, staring at the screen. The right answer was no. The right answer was to clean the house, prepare dinner, and wait for my family to come home. But my fingers betrayed me. Where should I meet you? The motel was as anonymous as always, its faded sign barely visible in the midday sun. Jason was already waiting in the parking lot when I arrived, leaning casually against his car. He smiled when he saw me, but I couldn't bring myself to smile back. "What's wrong?" he asked as we walked inside. "Nothing," I said too quickly, avoiding his gaze. Jason didn't press, but the weight of my guilt hung between us like a storm cloud. Even as his arms wrapped around me, even as I gave in to the pull I couldn't resist, the voice in the back of my mind whispered louder than ever, "This is going to destroy you." When I got home, Michael and the kids were already back. The sound of laughter filled the living room as I stepped inside, my heart racing. "Hey, Mom," my son called, holding up a plush toy he'd won at the arcade. "That's great, sweetie," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. Michael glanced at me from the couch, his expression unreadable. "Where were you?" he asked casually, too casually. "I ran a few errands," I said, my voice steady despite the panic clawing at my chest. Michael nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. It was then I realized the walls were closing in. That night, as I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My reflection didn't look like me anymore. There was a hollowness in my eyes, a heaviness in my expression that hadn't been there before. The guilt, the lies, the double life. It was all catching up to me, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it together. It happened on a Sunday morning. The house was unusually quiet. Michael had taken the kids to the park, giving me a rare couple of hours to myself. I thought about cleaning, maybe catching up on emails, but instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. My phone buzzed on the counter, and instinctively, I reached for it. "Jason, thinking of you," the message read. Simple, but enough to send my stomach into a familiar knot of longing and dread. I quickly deleted it, the guilt rising like bile in my throat. What I didn't notice was Michael's car pulling into the driveway earlier than expected. When the door slammed shut, I jumped, the phone still in my hand. Michael's voice carried through the house before I even saw him. "Rachel." I walked into the living room, my heart pounding. His face was flushed, his expression tense in a way I hadn't seen in years. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my hands trembled. He held up a piece of paper, a printed phone bill. At first, I didn't understand, but then I saw Jason's number, circled multiple times in red ink. "You want to tell me what this is?" Michael asked, his voice low, controlled, but laced with barely contained anger. I froze. The words caught in my throat. It's nothing," I stammered, knowing how pathetic it sounded. "Nothing," he snapped, stepping closer. "Calls, texts at all hours of the day? Don't insult my intelligence, Rachel." I opened my mouth, but no excuse came. The dam I'd been holding back for weeks, months, began to crack. "It's not what you think," I said finally, though even I didn't believe it. "Then tell me what it is," he said, his voice rising. "Explain to me why my wife is sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face. Is it just texts or is it more?" I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. That was all the confirmation he needed. Michael let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "After everything, this is how it goes? I work my ass off for this family, and this is how you repay me?" His words cut deep, but something inside me snapped. "Don't you dare act like you're the victim here," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You've been absent for years, Michael. You don't see me, you don't talk to me. You don't care about anything that isn't work. Don't turn this around on me," he fired back. "This isn't about me. It's about you sneaking off with whoever the hell he is." "His name is Jason," I said before I could stop myself. The look on Michael's face shifted, his anger giving way to something else. Shock, betrayal, disbelief. How long? He asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. I hesitated, the truth burning on the tip of my tongue. A few months, I admitted, barely able to get the words out. Michael shook his head, pacing the room like he couldn't stand still. I can't believe this, he muttered. Then he stopped, turning to face me. You know what? Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Maybe we're both guilty here. What are you talking about? I asked, frowning. Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he didn't want to say it. But then he did. There's someone at work, he admitted, his voice heavy. It hasn't gone as far as you and Jason, but it could have. His confession hit me like a blow to the chest. So this is my fault? I demanded, my voice rising. You were already halfway out the door, and you're blaming me? I'm not blaming you, he snapped. But maybe if we'd both been honest with ourselves sooner, we wouldn't be here now. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling between us like a thick fog. For the first time, I saw us for what we'd become, two people who'd built a life together, only to let it crumble under the weight of everything we never said. I don't know what to do, I said finally, my voice breaking. Neither do I, Michael admitted, his shoulders slumping. But we can't keep pretending, Rachel. Not anymore. We stood there, staring at each other across the chasm that had grown between us, neither of us knowing what came next. The silence in the house was unbearable. Michael had left the next morning with a single suitcase and an expression I couldn't read. His parting words replayed in my head on a cruel loop. This is on you, Rachel. You broke us. He was right. I had. For days, I stumbled through the motions of life. The kids noticed the tension, though I tried my best to shield them. Where's Dad? My daughter asked during dinner, her small voice trembling. Work's just keeping him busy, I said with a forced smile, but the words tasted bitter. How could I explain the truth when I could barely face it myself? Jason hadn't called or texted, which was a small mercy. Perhaps he knew the silence between us was necessary, even if it stung. Yet the ghost of him lingered in every quiet moment, his presence woven into the fabric of my unraveling life. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I texted him one last time. We need to talk. Jason was waiting at the cafe, his usual spot by the window. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. I took a deep breath and walked toward him, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. Rachel, he said softly as I sat across from him. I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. Instead, I stared at my hands, clasped tightly together on the table. Jason, I began, my voice trembling. This has to end. His expression darkened. Why? Because it's tearing my life apart, I said, forcing myself to look at him. It's tearing me apart. I can't keep doing this to my family, to myself. He leaned forward, his jaw tightening. You don't have to. Rachel, you don't have to go back to a life that makes you miserable. You don't have to go back to him. His words made something inside me ache, but I shook my head. This isn't about him, I said quietly. It's about me. I made a mistake, Jason. I thought you were the answer to everything I was missing, but you're not. You can't be. The silence between us felt heavier than anything I'd ever known. Jason leaned back, his expression softening as realization dawned. I don't regret this, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper.
Ido, he replied, mevrouw tijd.
Goodbye, Jason. I walked out of the cafe, my head spinning. Each step felt like I was dragging 1,000 pounds, but I kept going, knowing I couldn't look back. When I got home, the house was quiet, the kids already asleep. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faint outline of my reflection in the window. My mind was a whirlwind of guilt, regret, and the tiniest spark of relief. I'd ended it. I'd made the choice to stop, to face the wreckage I'd caused. But it wasn't over. Michael's absence loomed larger than ever, a constant reminder that the damage was already done. The sound of the front door creaking open made me freeze. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned, half expecting to see Michael standing there, his face softening with forgiveness. But it wasn't Michael. It was